Are we on? Okay, hello again to everybody. I'm Jeffrey Brown from PBS NewsHour, and because it is my second and last session, I just want to thank once again everybody here, you in the audience, Arlo, and the staff, which is fantastic. I am, like a lot of folks here, a veteran of these kind of literary gatherings, and this is, I hope you know, this is a good one, okay? So it's really worth saying. I also feel I should say, for those of you who were at yesterday's session that I did on poetry, and I have to say this because Jean chided me a little bit, where I was expounding my passion for poetry and how much I really wanted to do that session, and I came off and she said, "What are we, like, you know, you don't want to talk to us tomorrow?" So, you know, I feel it's important to say I have two panels here. I have two children. I mean, the subject is family. I know this feeling of, oh, you love one, not the other. No, I love both, okay? Good. So let's start on good terms. My thought here is really simple, that you've had a chance to hear all four of them, perhaps individually, doing some readings and talking a little bit, but now we're kind of mix things up and bring everybody together. And I will happily lead the way, but I'm encouraging everybody to just kind of jump in and we'll have a conversation. And we really follow the theme here because I appreciate Arlo giving it, and it's interesting how everybody has really stuck to the family theme. And here we are now in the kitchen, and the idea is around the family table, so we'll make it as literal as we can around the family kitchen table. And I want to kick it off by just asking to take yourselves back to your kitchen tables as children around the family. And were there books? Was there reading? Jean?
Of course, I'm going first. My mother didn't cook, so we didn't have much of a family table. My mother went back to school after I was born to become a family therapist, and that meant somebody else did the cooking. But we were, you know, that was completely normal to us, that we had a mother who just could barely boil water. Once a year on our birthdays, she made us these elaborate cakes from a mix, but then she would cut them into the shape of something that had been meaningful to us that year. So, you know, my sister had a Barbie cake, I had a horse cake, things like that. She was trying to do in one boxed cake mix what she had been unable to do every single night of the rest of the year. My family did have books. They were not artists, but they revered art, and that was just as good. I think of my family as a kind of classic American story, and that my paternal great-grandfather was a rag picker. His son had a shop. His son became a doctor so that his child could be an artist. And I think that's a great American story. I have felt incredibly privileged for my entire life, just thinking back to everything that had to happen in order for me to be in a position to say, I want to be a novelist. I did that pretty early, and I vividly remember, in fact, I was walking down the street a few weeks ago with my sister, and I pointed to the sidewalk and I said, "This is the place where Dad said to me, 'Do you think you have a novel in you?'" Vividly remember. And I said, yes.
What age were you?
Oh, I was about 14, 15.
Wow.
And I said yes, but I was lying. I was lying because the idea that I would ever be able to write a novel was so terrifying and so insane. I never thought I'd be able to do it. It was way before the idea of manifestation had I was ever aware of that. I wasn't manifesting, I was just terrified. And I've been pretty much terrified every day since. So. Continue to be terrified.
Lydia, what about your childhood kitchen table?
The kitchen, yeah, my mother did all the cooking, and she and my father did all the drinking. We had this thing called drinking and talking time, or they had it, which was like the hour after he came home from work as she made supper, and he would sit sort of on the edge of the kitchen, and she would cook, and they would drink 2 to 3 whiskeys every night, and it was always very comforting to us, this like ritual of drinking and talking time.
Were there books?
There were many books. That's all we ever sort of did as a family, was sit together and read different books.
Oh,
great.
Because we didn't have a TV till I was in my early teens, I guess. And yeah, so we always just sat quietly with the cats, reading our separate books when we had like leisure time.
Nathan?
Drinking and talking time sounds really nice. I feel like during the pandemic, I just had drinking and drinking time. When I was young, we moved around a lot. So I was born in Iowa, and my dad's job took us place to place to place to place. And every 2 years or so, we would move. And the family dining table was the place my parents would sit us all down and say, "We're moving." You know, so it was kind of a heartbreaking place. I remember one time, though, I was really, really young. We were living in Clinton, Iowa, and we got sat down, and my mom said, "We're gonna go see the rabbits." And I was like, "That's amazing. I love rabbits." And so we packed up the car. We moved to this new place. We got out. I looked around. It was this like sad apartment building, and I was like, "Where are the rabbits?" and my mom was like, "What are you talking about?" And she had actually said, "We're moving to Cedar Rapids." I was so disappointed. We didn't have a lot of books in the house. My parents weren't really readers. They weren't against it. It just wasn't on their radar really. But I discovered that whenever we would go, to Kmart and I would ask for a toy, my parents would never buy me a toy. But if I asked for a book, they would always buy me a book. And so I just started asking for books. And when you're a kid who moves around a lot, whenever you're the new kid, there's that awkward few months where you don't know anybody. And so like books were my friends. And so, yeah, I became a reader, I think, because of it.
Mm-hmm. And John?
I'm remembering how little my mother read, but I forgave her even when I became a reader and a would-be writer. She was an OB-GYN nurse's aide. She had other work to do, other stories to tell, and she wasn't much interested in reading. But the two readers in my life were my grandmother, who I virtually grew up with. She was my mother until I was 6, and my mother met and married the man who became my stepfather. He died 2 days ago at the age of 100. And he was not only the savior in my mother's life, but very much so in mine. He was a reader, as was my grandmother. And I've written about this in various forms of books. All the stepfathers in my novels are heroes. My stepfather was mine. The conceit of the benign or wonderful stepfather seemed to me to be important to contradict that image of the villainous stepfather. My mother was never so encouraging. It was only with the publication of my 6th novel, The Cider House Rules, when she had something mildly encouraging to say. She said, "I've been waiting for your social conscience to kick in."
Wow.
My stepfather was more encouraging, as was my grandmother, who tried, when I was 12 or 13, to read Moby Dick to me. I couldn't get it. I was 17 before I read Moby Dick. And when my grandmother was dying, I read it to her. And that seemed to me to be a full circle. But the books were belated. Like Eugene, I became convinced that I had to be a novelist at the age of 15. And it seemed an utterly unrealizable dream at the time, especially because the models of the form for me were and remain the novels of the 19th century, so that I was already doomed, I felt, to failure or obscurity because I desired to model myself on these novels that my schoolmates, the few of them that read anything at all, and they were very few, they despised those novels. The novels of the 19th century were the novels people were made to read in school. And most of my friends hated them. But these were the ones that motivated me. And my stepfather and grandmother, of course, supported that. They liked the 19th century novel, too. But they were a hell of a lot closer to the 19th century than I was. So it was more realistic for them to have these novels as their models.
So, well, Gene, if you too knew at 14 that you wanted to be a novelist, what were the books that stoked that caused that?
I think the first novel that made me just kind of lose my mind was Black Beauty. Black Beauty. See, there it is. I mean, I was a horsey girl. I rode. That was a big passion of mine. But the language in Black Beauty, I still remember it. I could probably quote it right now. No, I won't. But it was so beautiful. And the other book that made a huge impression wasn't a novel. It was D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths.
Oh, yes.
Which made me an atheist. I became an atheist because of D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. I also remember the exact park bench in Central Park where that happened. That was every time I passed that, I'm like, yeah, that's where that happened. It made an entire college class in Greek mythology completely redundant. I didn't learn a thing in that class because I knew it all from D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. But it was probably the single most life-altering book I've ever read, and it wasn't a novel. So there you go.
You're going to do a guide to New York someday with your...
I don't think anybody really cares, but my kids care, I'll tell them,
Yeah.
But when I tell my mother, D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths made me an atheist, she reminds me that she was already an atheist. And, maybe I wouldn't listen to her, but I would listen to the D'Aulaire's.
Yeah. So Lydia, where do you come in this, the age when it hit you that you would be a writer, and what were the books that you modeled there?
Well, I don't know that I wasn't trying to sort of emulate or aspire to anything exactly that I had read. I just had always been immersed in all kinds of books I still love children's books now. And I still love Dr. Seuss and the Narnia books and all that. And I actually, when I was a teenager, was planning to be an opera singer. And I sang for a lot of hours for, I don't know, I guess 5 or 6 years. And then realized that I had the incorrect personality to be an opera singer.
Which meant what?
What's the correct personality?
It's not mine.
Okay.
Well, I would get, extraordinarily anxious before performances. I didn't like the other musicians. And I had this feeling that I was just repeating, doing a sort of a worse rendition of things that had been done better by others. But I always was writing my whole life. I had always been writing. I just hadn't thought that would be monetized. So I was probably 19 or 20 before I settled on doing that as the main thing. But always
Still very
reading
young.
throughout. Yeah, pretty young, pretty young.
Yeah, that is still pretty young to make a decision.
Yeah.
And then when you made that decision, did you do it in a formal, like, how does one set about?
Well, I was in college and I was always taking workshops and had lovely teachers. This was in Chapel Hill. And teachers that remained my friends, some of them for their whole lives, for the rest of their lives. And and so I was always writing. I wrote a terrible novel as my honors thesis. I think it was called The Stone Fountain. I wrote also poems that were very bad.
Yeah.
So throughout college, I was working at being a bad writer.
I assume you all have some terrible novels in there, right? Or, yeah, you have.
Oh yeah. Like
And you keep them around?
Fortunately, they were stolen. So after I finished, I got an MFA in fiction writing from University of Massachusetts, and after I finished, moved to New York City, and I had this day in New York. I had a 1-month sublet apartment in Queens, and I was looking for a more permanent apartment, and there was this I found one, but there was this awkward day where I had to be out of my sublet in the morning. I couldn't move into my other apartment until the evening, so I put everything I owned in my car and went to work and came back from work, and the car was empty. Everything had been stolen. So 3 years of writing, everything I did in my MFA program, novels, short stories, they were all taken, including the discs, because back then you back things up on discs still, had also been taken. So it was just gone, and that was incredibly painful at the moment, but now I look back on it, I'm like, thank God. Those books didn't come out. Like, they were terrible. Like, thank God I had another chance at that, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You know, we skipped a little chapter in your life. So, I mean, you left us driving to see the rabbits, right? and with no books, or a few books.
Yeah.
And then here you are.
Along the way. I mean, I think...
Yeah, what were the books that you read that made you change find your way?
There are two that come to mind. One is Where the Red Fern Grows. I remember just weeping in my bed at the end of that novel when the dogs die heroically saving the boy, and I remember really thinking, like, how in the world are these, like, marks on a page making me feel this way? I was like, this is wondrous, you know. And then I was also really into choose your own adventure books at the time. You know, the bookmobile would come to school, and I would pick up choose your own adventure books, and my friends and we would all kind of play them. And I remember in 3rd grade, there was a writing contest in my class, and so I wrote a choose your own adventure book. A whole book, and as a super overachiever, I guess. I illustrated it. My mom bound it for me, and she was my editor. And the only edit she had, the only note she had, was that, like, in almost every ending of this book, you die horribly, like, in increasingly exotic ways. And she was like, I think the word die is a little strong. Can you just say, like, maybe you're gone? And so I took that note, and it won the contest. And my teacher was reading the book to the class, and they were all kind of playing it, and I was in the back of the room, just like, yes, this is what I want to do.
So John, you mentioned the 19th century novels, and the other night you mentioned Great Expectations. What was it? I mean, what do they have that you wanted to emulate, and how did you go about doing that?
They had most of all a dramatic or a theatrical structure. They were dramatized. The Bronte sisters were wonderful for accentuating the drama in a situation. They made literature stimulate you emotionally. Mm-hmm. It wasn't show-off writing. Look how smart I am. What put me off about the modern or the contemporary novel was the desire of the writer to make himself or herself appear smart. I wanted to be emotionally, dramatically charged. And if that has a literal origin, it again goes back to my non-reading mother, who did volunteer her services to the small-town local theater where I lived as a prompter. It was the perfect job for my mother when she wasn't dealing with the childbirth or abortion subject. Being a prompter, whispering, usually loud enough for the people in the front row of the audience to hear her, correcting bonehead actors in a local theater's mistakes, was the perfect job for her. She would sit there with the text, and when an amateur actor would stumble, she knew how to prompt people. She really did. And she met my stepfather because he was a young actor in this local amateur theater, one who didn't need prompting. This, I think, impressed her. But my earliest aspirations before the writing kicked in was I thought I could be an actor. And all through school and university, I frequently did student productions. I loved Shakespeare. But I depressed myself because I think I auditioned for Romeo and Juliet at least 4 or 5 times. And I never expected to be Romeo, which is not a very good part. Juliet has all the good things to say. But I hoped one day to be Mercutio. That's who I thought I could be. But every time I auditioned for Romeo and Juliet, I was Tybalt.
Yeah.
The stage direction for Tybalt is, Tybalt, enter with sword.
With sword.
That's all Tybalt has to say for himself. He's a moron. He's a thug and he's a moron. And thank goodness, for the audience's sake, he is quickly killed. But I began to realize that the syndrome for me as an actor was that I was always cast as the fool or the villain. I never had a part that had the slightest complexity. And one day I asked a director, this was in Pittsburgh, another university production, I said, I always get these parts. Why do I get these parts? And he said, well, it's because you're an overactor. And villains and fools are good at overacting. Well, of course, later I realized I was an overwriter too. That it came naturally to me, overdoing.
Yeah.
Which I suppose you could also accuse the 19th century novel of overdoing, dramatically speaking. But one day, also in Pittsburgh, I thought my fortunes had changed because I was actually cast in what I thought was the lead in Richard III. I was Richard III. And the guy who cast me was the same guy who told me I was an overactor. So I thought, something must have happened. I must be better than he thought or I thought I was. So I asked him later in the rehearsals, why had my fortune changed? He shook his head and said, Johnny, Richard III is a minor character. He just doesn't know it. Well, of course it's true. Richard III is a moron. He's no more fit to be king than I was. The play begins with him complaining. Now is the winter of our discontent. He doesn't mean our, he means his. He's a self-pitying asshole. That's who he always is. How does the play end? A horse, my kingdom for a horse. He's a whining, sniveling coward, right? I got the part. So, this convinced me, stick to the writing. Just right.
Well, I thought you were very good as the wrestling umpire in the world according to Garb.
Yeah. So, one of the, of course, fascinating themes of the last few days has been the way that family gets into everyone's writing, sometimes your own families directly. So I want to talk a little bit about this. We've talked about some of your experience and how you became writers, but then how do you use that experience and the people around you, parents, siblings, whatever, spouses, children, how do they come into your writing? Why don't you start this, Lydia? I mean, where do you see it? How early did it happen, and how did you use that family experience?
Well, I think that for many books and many years, I didn't feel that I was directly stealing from, my own life, I guess, that I was directly representing anything. Mm-hmm. And, John was talking about sort of emotionless, the coldness of some of the writing of modernism and postmodernism, maybe. And I was a sort of colder writer when I was younger, and I also wrote more, I don't know, broader things with humor, but also more outrageous or sort of, exaggerated things. Mm-hmm. And as I get older, I find, like with my more recent books, that I am writing more from my own life. And I don't know if that's a lack of imagination, that I've just used up the other stuff, and am repeating, repeating myself now. But I do find, somewhere around when I turned 30 or something, I began also to write sort of toward love and emotion, and less, with a less sort of skeptical cast to everything. Or, I began to feel that skepticism was sort of a cop-out. And now I am kind of obsessed with writing about children, and I do take, I think, a lot of it from my own family. So I don't know. I don't know if that's. I actually don't know if that's a good sign or a bad one in my case.
Are you aware of it when you're doing it? I mean, are you thinking directly to past experience or your own direct family?
Yeah. I'm writing from emotions that I have around my own children. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my own parents, I guess, in a way that I didn't when I was younger. When I think I just wanted to distance myself. I had a great family, by the way, very kind, everyone, but I thought we were boring.
Yeah. Nathan?
Yeah, I have to apologize to my mother every time a new book comes out. I didn't really tell her anything. My first book is called The Knicks, and I didn't really tell her anything about it. I was working on it for 10 years, and I think she just disbelieved I was even a writer at that point. And then the book sold, and she's like, "Oh, great, what's it about?" And I'm like, "It's about a mom who abandons her family." There's this long pause, and like any classic Midwesterner, she's like, "What are people gonna think?"
I did notice that you dedicated this new one to your parents.
I did, and they were very sweet about it. Again, I told them that this book it's about two people coming from very challenging family situations, but the dedication is to my parents, who are lovely people, and it was actually had a really nice moment with that. Like I had the galleys. I got the galleys for my new book right like a couple days before my parents were visiting us to go on a camping trip together. We were going to Myakka State Park up near Sarasota, and we're going camping together. And so we were all around the campfire, and I showed them the galleys. And I was like, flip to the next page, and then they got to the dedication page, saw it was to them, and they both started crying. It was a really sweet moment. But I do have to tell them that that when I'm writing a scene, I'm trying to get the character and the reader to some emotional place, and when I'm doing that, I'll often take from my own life, but I will take from my own life, but change it, alter it, make it worse, you know, and so I tell them they will see things that are familiar to them, but the way it makes the character feel is not how I actually felt in that moment. I'll change it. I do this to my friends who I'm terrible. A friend of mine told me this story one time about how you know, she woke up and in the night her daughter had creeped into bed with her, and she woke up and her daughter was looking at her and the sun was coming through the window, and her daughter says, "Mommy, you're beautiful." It was like this great moment. And then, of course, in one of my books, I changed it so that the next morning, the mom's like, "And what do we say to Mommy in the morning?" and then starts punishing the girl if she doesn't say she's beautiful every morning. And so that's kind of what I mean. Like, I'll take these things that are from real life, but I'll change them so that they have the emotional valence that I need.
These are conscious acts, though, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
You're grabbing them and then saying, "That's good, but I better..."
I need to, if I want the reader to feel a certain way, I'm going to have to push it in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Jean?
I rejoice in the fact that I am not an autobiographical writer. I have never written a novel about my family, and I never will. But, I mean, as you were saying, there are little shards of experiences that get thrown back in there, and then they come out in weird ways, and sometimes people recognize them, and then they say, "Aha, you're writing autobiographically." Several times I've written novels for which there's a kind of ghost text of another story. I wrote a novel, The Sabbath Day River, which owes a lot to The Scarlet Letter. My novel, The White Rose, is basically a retelling, a reimagining of the Strauss opera Der Rosenkavalier. And most recently, The Latecomer, which is in many ways the book I'm proudest of. The book that I thought about constantly as I was writing it was The World According to Garp. And maybe this is a good time to say this, but when I talked about that book, and I would say that, there would be always the same response from the audience. There would be this kind of huge communal sigh of pleasure, and it was such a beautiful thing, and I got to the point where I would just stick it in there just because I wanted the sigh. And I really feel that this is what we're after as writers. This is the greatest compliment that can be paid to a novel 50 years after its publication. That level of sweetness and goodness and love. You know, it'd be nice to make the bestseller list one day. I'm not saying it wouldn't. I know my publisher would like it a lot too, but you know, if 50 years from The Latecomer, you know, just the utterance of the title can elicit a huge communal sigh from an audience of people I don't know and I'm not related to, that would be the best.
What was it that you were, I'll just push it further. I mean, what was it that had stuck with you in those 50 years, and that you were, if you're trying to write your novel, but you have this model in your mind.
And it was not a model of plot or even characters. It was just this sense that, you know, people can wander in the wilderness and terrible things can happen to them, but the weirdness of life and the strange coincidences that happen and the ways we change, whether we want to or not. And, you know, I just left them all dancing on a beach, and that just seemed like the right thing to do. And I don't know. I mean, it's not as if people who read the book and thought, "Oh, this is obviously The World According to Garp." But when I pointed it out, they were, "Oh yes, now I see that."
One thing you said the other night, John, that stuck with me was you were talking about thinking about what does love look like in alternative families. A lot of our discussions have been about this very direct, active family. You've taken a lot of parts of your own life, but also extrapolated and thought about this idea of alternative families. What does that mean to you?
It means a family outside of the normal expectations of what a happy or even a traditionally unhappy family might be. It's a family socially or sexually sort of out of the norm. I think, like Nathan, I'm a make everything worse guy. I'm a doomsayer, and so I do take to use Jean's word, I do take the autobiographical shards of my childhood and early adolescence, and often base those autobiographical beginnings at the beginning of a novel. And after that, everything changes. After that, everything is not the same. There are many mothers in unusual or alternative, to use your word, alternative circumstances in my novels. But my mother never accused me of writing about her. On the contrary, she would say, as the books accumulated, "Who are all these mothers? Who are these women that weren't your mother? Who are they?" And I would say, "Well, they're not me," she'd say. And I say, "Well, no, they're not." And my wonderful stepfather would say, my mother was named Frances, but she was very forward and aggressive. Everyone called her Frankie. My stepfather stepped in and said, "Frankie, you wouldn't want John to write about you, would you?" And my mother turned to me and said, "Don't you dare." But she never accused me of so doing. She was just really pissed off about the other mothers, that they weren't her. It was a little conflicted, shall we say, but I've not been accused by former wrestling coaches or wrestling teammates or whoever. No one has ever come after me upon the publication of a book and said, "How dare you?" Not the tragic girlfriends, not anybody. No one has ever identified himself or herself because of the take it a step too far, make it, take it further, and usually in a doomed direction. I don't necessarily work toward happy endings. That's another sort of dramatic infusion that I have certainly appropriated or borrowed from the 19th century novel, both consciously and unconsciously. I think the support for social outsiders, sexual outliers, has always been integral to my work because I felt in my own way, the way I believe many writers do, I felt in my own way like an outsider because I was a writer, because I was always, it felt to me, detached from my life and observing it more than I was a participant. I was observing. And the observations extended beyond what I read. In my reading, as a reader, certainly I was an observer. But in life, thinking more actively about what I was imagining than I usually was about what I was experiencing, that made me an outlier or an outsider too.
You know, I don't know if you heard Billy Collins this morning, but he was talking about his notion of the poets sitting in the house alone, looking out at the world or just thinking about the world. His idea of the novelist being on the outside, on the street, looking at windows, at families or lives, and writing those families. That jibes with what you're talking about, being the outsider, I think, looking in.
Well, and in the process of, I don't know how true this is for my fellow writers, but because my novels are also ending-driven, the notes add up, the storylines, the cast of characters, the idea for a novel accumulates over many more years than it will take me to write it once I begin. The extreme example would have been Last Night in Twisted River, which existed as a storyline, a plot line, a cast of characters, a pile of pages for 20 years before I started it. That's unusual. But no novel has taken me more than 7, 8, at the most 9 years to write from the moment I begin, including the research. But many novels have accumulated that storyline and that cast of characters for more years before I begin. So that there are works in progress that I'm not ready to write yet because I don't yet know enough about everything.
You know, I was also thinking about this idea of taking it and making it worse, which you've both used in a slightly different way. And partly from your reading the other day, the first chapter of your new book, where two people are looking at each other across a divide, right? Two apartment buildings, making up stories of one another, telling their story, which turns out to be completely wrong, right? So much of, well, it's a question, is how much of it is, you know, we like to say, novelists tell us our story, you know, they're storytellers. But what's always more interesting is that the story turns out to be, the story we tell ourselves is wrong. You're clearly playing with that.
I am, yeah. I reread White Noise recently for the first time in a long time. I really like this line DeLillo has in that book where he says, family is the cradle of the world's misinformation.
Yeah.
And I think when in the context of that book, what he's talking about is that one's family is maybe your first echo chamber. But the way I kind of think of it is that you know, families, from the time you're very small, families exist in this kind of delicate homeostasis, you know, and sometimes the participants adopt these roles so that the larger unit can function, you know, the peacemaker, the golden child, the black sheep, etc. And my two characters in Wellness, you know, Elizabeth grows up with this very demanding father who's so insecure that he demands perfection from her because she's a reflection of him. But then also is so insecure that when it becomes clear that she's smarter than he is, also reacts very badly. And so she grows up with this story, like achieve, but not too much, you know? And then Jack grows up in this kind of rural place with not a lot of money, with a mother who demands kind of all resources, care, and love go to her, and there's nothing left over for him. And like a lot of kids in that situation, his psyche does the little dance where he says, well, if I'm not being loved, maybe it's because I don't really need it, and maybe further, maybe I don't deserve it. And he grows up with that story. And so when they meet each other, you know, what they think of as compatibility is really just that their wounds are symmetrical, are perfectly symmetrical. A boy who's afraid of what he wants meets a girl afraid to be wanted. And it takes a lifetime to sort that out. So yeah, I think we grow up with stories that are useful for a part of our lives that need to be discarded when we graduate to other parts of our lives.
We'll open this up for questions in just a couple of minutes, so please get ready. But I wanted to, Lydia, because you're doing something different in recent books. I mean, you're expanding this notion of family and the stories we tell about ourselves to the human family amid coming disasters, or never mind coming, I guess they're upon us.
Yeah.
How do you think about that, both at the kind of granular level and then the larger level?
I was thinking about what you said, that Billy Collins said about looking outward versus inward. And I actually think that a problem of modern fiction has been maybe that posture with regard to the house, if it is true. I mean, I feel like I'm looking out the window more personally, or I care to look out the window. I hope I'm not solipsistic all the time and looking in the mirror, and I think I'm not. I think I would be horrified to be doing that. But I think, that sort of focus on the purely domestic and the purely human in our fiction has harmed us. I think the stories need to be also that larger world and the part that we play in it, and they can still have that warmth and humor that I admired in John's books when I was a teenager, for example, like that. Just that tone of warmth can exist even when we're writing about massive and sweeping things. I think so much in whether fiction is charismatic is just about tone and voice and not about anything structural. But I do think we need to tell stories that, redefine family as also the rest of living critters that we share our life support with. Yeah.
Your latest book, though, is nonfiction, right? So was this a way of thinking about new type of storytelling, especially given the larger subject?
I mean, I hope so. It was strange for me to write nonfiction, and I felt sort of imposter-like at the beginning because I'm so used to having the cover of made-up people. But there's also something very emotionally, earnest about, because I've always tried to write with humor, and this book wasn't as funny. And there's something really pure about not writing a book in which you don't digress from passion and care, and you just persevere without the embellishments of, say, laughable characters or terrible characters, and you just go straight forward and are thinking and feeling. And so, that's what I was doing with that, I hope.
Why don't we open this up for, I think we have about 10 minutes. While everyone's getting ready, I want you to think about one thing. You've all done that New York Times buy the book feature, right? And since we're at the kitchen table here, before we end, I want you to tell me who you'd like to have around your table with you.
The big
1,
question.
2, 3 writers who you wish you could have breakfast with. Well, I mean, breakfast comes with some baggage. You might have woken up with them. I don't know. So dinner, lunch, whatever meal you'd like to have. Okay, we'll save that for the very end. Are there questions?
If you have a question, please stand and wait for the mic to come to you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to hear it. I want you all to pursue that question about how those baggage of perceptions that you have when you're a child, and then as you perceive your parents as kind of older from a different perspective. You said that your family was very boring, and now you have come to appreciate it. If you could comment how big of a shift of paradigm you had when you were stuck in a certain view of your family, and then when you're in your 20s and 30s, you see your parents and your own experience so different, how that has changed and what is that about?
Well, that's a big question. It's a big question for all of us, I think. I want to just clarify that my family is not objectively boring. I am not making that claim. It's just that, it's the landscape you live in, right, when you're younger. That's your landscape, and it's hard to see it with fresh eyes because that's the world. And then you emerge from that world into a larger one, and of course, with that, the distance that is acquired and the perspective of distance and the ability to distinguish one thing from another, you have, we hope, new insight into that place you came from.
I also certainly went through a phase where I thought my family was pretty boring, at least from a I want to be a novelist when I grow up perspective. But when I I mentioned this to my mother, she said, well, you know, we do have a writer in our family. And that's when I found out that I was related to Helene Hanff, who wrote 84 Charing Cross Road. So Helene, I was about 16 at the time, and Helene sort of became my eccentric aunt. And I really loved knowing her, and she loved to tell people that she had brought my Hanff out of the closet. My middle name was Hanff. It was really horrible. You know, everybody had a middle name like Susie or Debbie, and I had Hanff. And the first thing I ever published was a review of one of her books in 17 magazine, and that was the first time my Hanff came out of the closet. So I was lucky. I had a real writer in the family that I could discover at just the right moment.
I think
The question in the balcony.
I think what you're asking is where empathy in writing comes from. And in my case, however odd or not the norm I might have thought the family I grew up in was, nothing has informed my being a writer and what I write about as having children. Nothing as much as having children not necessarily altered, but made me much more empathetic to people not like myself and to other families, to all alternative families, because at the time I felt very unlucky to get someone pregnant, be married, and to have a child before I graduated from college. I felt unfairly abused by these circumstances. But from the moment I had a child, I realized what it meant to love someone incontrovertibly more than yourself. And nothing mattered as much as protecting or looking after that child, which extended my empathy to members in my wider family that I had not had so much empathy for. But being a father changed all of that. Later, after a divorce, then with custody of 2 children, a single parent, that also helped. I mean that sincerely. It fueled the it fueled the empathy. I would be a very different writer, empathetically, had I not had children. But from the moment that first child was born, I had something that mattered more than me. It was also the birth of that child was also a revelation to me, belatedly, of my own out-of-itness, politically and otherwise. I was then in my 4th year of officer training. Had that child not been born, which caused my dismissal from the U.S. Army as unfit for combat because I was a father, I was so stupid, I felt sorry for myself. I wasn't going to get to see the war that might have been interesting as a writer to see. This was 1965 when that child was born. By 1968, my closest friends that I had begun officer training with in Pittsburgh in 1961 were all dead in Vietnam. And to this day, that child, my eldest, my son, Colin, whenever we have a disagreement about something, a book, a film, a wrestling match, Colin points to me and says, "Hey, don't forget who kept you out of Vietnam."
All right, I hope you'll get to ask your questions later because we're running out of time. I'll take my prerogative to just do my, who would you like to have, who among the writers, past, present company excluded, of course, who would you like to?
Oh, I was going to say present company.
Yeah.
I was going to take the easy way out. When I found out I was going to be on this panel, I was like, well, that's it. That's 2025 is set. Can you come back to me? I forgot to think about that question.
Right. Who's got, Jean?
Well, I just did it, so you can probably get on your phone what I said, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. So my answer was Sylvia Plath, and two women whom I was lucky enough to meet, but would have liked to have known better: Wendy Wasserstein and Nora Ephron. There it is again.
Lydia?
Yeah, I never have an answer to that question. I don't know what I said for by the book. I must have made up some lie. Because I never, first of all, your heroes are often so disappointing when you actually meet them. And then, writers also are not always great conversationalists because they're better at writing than talking, and I certainly am. So yeah, I say I would probably just, I don't know, take a nap.
All right, Lydia's eating alone.
I do love eating alone, actually.
You do like eating alone.
Well,
okay.
that's a question I've thought about before, and it's an easy one. It's an easy one for me. I wish I could have known the Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens, and Herman Melville.
Okay.
That's it. That would make me very happy. Emily and Charlotte and Charles and Herman.
I guess I'd say just
That's
really,
it.
really
What about
quickly.
Anne? What about Anne Bronte?
Poor Anne.
Poor Anne.
The two writers that I feel like I was influenced most by, they're very different and it's very strange, but Virginia Woolf, I love Mrs. Dalloway. I reread it every year probably. I love Donald Barthelme, the kind of his zany, absurdist short fiction makes me laugh consistently. And then I guess just because I like to laugh a lot, I'd throw in David Sedaris because I'm sure he'd be really entertaining at a dinner party. So.
All right. Eat well.
What about yours?
No. I asked the questions here. We're done. Thank you all very much. Yeah.